In 2002, Congress established the Department of Homeland Security in response to the 9/11 attacks to centralize and consolidate to prevent terrorist attacks. In the 20 years since its creation, the Department of Homeland Security has departed from its original mission and used its expansive authorities and funding to impede on the rights of American citizens. This is not just my opinion. In November 2022, the ACLU concluded, 20 years later, it's past time to seriously reconsider DHS. Its abusive practices aren't just antithetical to our values. They're a waste of taxpayer dollars and a distraction from serious problems facing people in our country. What should terrify every American is that the full extent of DHS's abuse of power against its own citizens are still largely unknown. The public is only recently learning the degree to which the department's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, was employed to surveil and censor American citizens' social media for what it concluded to be misinformation and disinformation. What was the result? Statements about COVID-19 that are now supported by evidence were flagged as disinformation. Statements, including my own, that were once labeled by our government as disinformation, such as opinions on the efficacy of masks, naturally acquired immunity, and the origins of COVID-19, are now supported by the majority of people and by the evidence, but were labeled by the government as misinformation. The government worked with social media, in fact, to censor these opinions. This is something that shouldn't happen in a free country and is contrary to the spirit and the law of the First Amendment. In 2021, DHS even put out a video encouraging children to report their own family members to Facebook for disinformation if they challenge the U.S. government narratives on COVID-19. Does that not sound like something out of 1984? Does that not sound like something out of Stalin's Russia, that our government's trying to get our kids to report their parents? I mean, that's crazy. Can you imagine? Your agency's putting out a video to tell kids to report their parents if they say something like, well, maybe children don't need to be vaccinated. I still say that because it's the truth. The risks for the vaccine are greater than the disease for COVID for children. It's different for the elderly and those who are targeted with the disease, but that's an opinion based in fact, based on peer-reviewed papers. But that's not that government shouldn't get involved with trying to censor and restrict my ability to say these things. In reality, the most significant source of disinformation during the pandemic, with the most influence and greatest impact on the people's lives, was the U.S. government. The greatest purveyor of disinformation has been the U.S. government. All of this was occurring during what was likely the greatest national security threat to our nation in modern history, a global pandemic that killed millions of Americans. During this time, the Department of Homeland Security, working to determine the origins of COVID-19 pandemic and whether taxpayer funding went to conduct risky research in China, was this going on? To our knowledge, we know of no delving into this by the DHS. Where did the virus come from? If it came from a lab, wouldn't that be a biosecurity threat? Isn't that somehow under the purview of the DHS to be looking at where the virus might have come from? At least several of the intelligence agencies now conclude it did come from there. Dozens and dozens of the most esteemed scientists in our country now conclude that it came from a lab. We have labs doing this research in our country. Are you looking into that? You know, what's going on? Are you really trying to protect us from biological threats if we're not being told that you've looked into the origins of COVID virus at all? Instead of focusing on real threats like this, DHS was internally strategizing on how it can expand social media censorship of Americans using third-party nonprofits, as in the words of a CISA official who said, a clearinghouse for information to avoid the appearance of government propaganda. So here's our government using NGOs and using them as a clearinghouse, but let's make sure nobody sees that it's us so it doesn't look overtly like government propaganda. That's coming from your own agencies. A report published last month by the Brennan Center for Justice found at least 12 overlapping DHS programs for tracking what Americans are saying online. It found that the department's programs have veered from its original counterterrorism mission into tracking social and political movements and monitoring First Amendment protected activity of American citizens. This is a serious abuse of power. The report concluded that overbroad mandates, flimsy safeguards, and fragmented oversight have allowed overreach and abuses to proliferate across DHS intelligence programs. This is the kind of abuse of power that should terrify all of us, regardless of which side of the aisle you are on. Even worse, it is taking place while the department is failing miserably at one of its core responsibilities, securing our border. Congress cannot continue to provide more funding responsibility to an agency that so clearly misunderstands its statutory authorities and purpose.